Social Justice and a Living Wage, Sunday, November 18th, 1934. May I address this audience on the subject of the justice associated with a living wage and, inferentially, with the injustice of our modern capitalistic structure which prevents the laborer from receiving this wage. I shall begin with a quotation from the pen of Mr. Lamont Dupont, the president of E.I. Dupont, de Nemours and Company. This quotation, which I shall read you, expresses clearly and concisely the philosophy of the modern capitalist and industrialist in relation to the rest of their fellow men. It reads as follows: I mean that all government regulation of businesses as such and as distinguished from any other forms of activity should be abolished. I mean that business should not be prohibited by government or compelled by government to do things which private individuals are not prohibited or compelled to do. Business should be treated as an individual is treated, no better, no worse. More than 130 years ago, Mr. Dupont's ancestor came to the shores of Rhode Island and brought with him this germ of this cold-blooded, selfish, unsocial philosophy. He was a member of an organization in France known as the Physiocrats. Their chief motto was laissez-faire, which roughly translated means let us alone, let us do as we please, let us manufacture what we will. If not expressed, there was at least implied the belief that government should be regulated by industry, that the citizens of a nation must be subjected to the whims and fancies of the manufacturer, that the laboring class should be considered as nothing more than pawns to be played with, to be used and cast into the discard with the mad struggle for individualistic wealth. It was the principle of anarchy reduced to business, and for the wealth of business. Laws for everything, but none for business. No law over business. It is a law unto itself. I am not quoting this publicized statement to signal out Mr. Dupont, America's foremost industrialist. He is only representative of his class, which, as long as it retains its belief in this anarchical and unsocial creed, is inviting upon its own head the wrath of an aroused people. I am referring to it merely to quote alongside it a statement from the pen of Donald Richburg, the executive director of the National Emergency Council under Mr. Roosevelt. He says, nothing has been more clearly proved in the last 20 years than that in its intricacies of modern trade and industry, with personal responsibility largely concealed behind a screen of corporate complexities, it has become possible for businessmen to prey upon each other and the public by methods that are just as vicious in their ethical quality and in their social results as such time-honored practices as forgery and embezzlement. These, my friends, are two statements which are contradictory. The one is representative of a class which refuses to admit the existence of social justice, which opposes the idea that industry has social duties. The other is more in keeping with the thoughts which I have tried to express, namely that the old order of industry must be abolished, that its independence, its superiority to government, its lack of obligation to its laborers, its profits for stakeholders, and bread lines for the workers' theory must be upheld. I mean that all government regulation of business should be abolished. So says this mighty prince of industry in one breath, while in another he commissions his agents to sell munitions to all governments and his lobbyists to influence protective legislation. Before discussing further these two contradictory theories, may I submit to you a few principles in which I believe and which are either directly or indirectly associated with a just and living wage. This or any other government which is duly instituted exists only at the sufferance of the people and for the common welfare of all the people, not for the particular welfare of any individual class, be it industrialist or financial. Therefore, it is the business of government not only to regulate reasonably the conduct of individuals in their dealings with each other, but also to regulate the conduct of the manufacturer to the laborer, whether the manufacturer is an individual or a corporation of individuals. Although there are two kinds of property rights, namely private property owned by private individuals and public property owned by the nation, nevertheless the ownership of private property does not argue that the owner of it may do with his property what he pleases. If I own a shotgun, that is no argument why I may kill my neighbor's child. If I own a factory, that is no argument why I may starve the laborers to make profits and profits only for the stockholders. All property is subject to control. All property is owned primarily by Almighty God, who gave us this earth and the fullness thereof, its fields and its forests, its mines and its factories, to be used, if not owned, for the common welfare of every person. This the physiocrat, the DuPont, the laissez-faire philosopher denies as he places himself not only on par with Almighty God, but above him, in that he claims the unlimited use of those properties which he privately owns. This is a doctrine which is twin brother to atheism. This is the doctrine which is antisocial in that it disbelieves by its practice that we are our brother's keepers. Finally, this is the doctrine which protests against liberty as wealthy manufacturers reduce the laboring class into bondage of economic slavery and forced, unprofitable idleness. If it is the duty of government to regulate business with the thought in mind that this nation and its wealth primarily belongs to God and was bestowed upon us for the common welfare of the common people, I believe that, in the present state of human society, it is advisable that the hourly wage contract should be abolished. In its stead, legislation should be passed by which the laborer would receive an annual wage which would enable him to live in decency according to the American standard. I believe that this annual wage should not be siphoned from the earnings of the worker only while he works. It should be paid to him primarily from the profits which he has helped to create for the manufacturer. Moreover, instead of hourly wage contract, there should be a contract of partnership not in the ownership of the business, but partnership in the profits of the business, by which both laborer and industrialist shall reap their just reward. I believe that modern industry is by its very nature related to the social order. It is composed of capital, of labor, and of brains. Unless, therefore, these three combine together for the common good, unless this social and individual character of labor be recognized, business itself shall fail and labor shall never be adequately compensated. Capital cannot do without labor, and least of all, it cannot subsist with an indigent element of labor existing in our country. I further believe that although private industry is privately owned, nevertheless, because of its social character, it depends upon the laborer for its operation. Thus, the representatives of labor should have a voice in the management of the business. Hitherto the management has been left in the hands of those who are interested solely in profits for the stockholders and not in conveniences for human beings. I further maintain that it is not only the right of every laborer to plan for the day when he can support his wife and his children from the revenue of his pay envelope, but he has a further right to look towards that future day when, from the savings derived from his pay envelope, he can become an owner of property himself. This nation and no other nation can subsist unless there is a wide distribution of private ownership. Today, the majority of our homes and farms are held under a form of servile contract and not under deeds of ownership. This is the result of the concentration of profits in the hands of a few, namely the concentration of property into the hands of few. I uphold the principle that it is unjust on the part of the laborer to demand wages so high that an employer cannot pay them without ruin and without consequent distress to the working people themselves. Wages must not be so high that they shall drain industry of its working capital and shall force the capitalist to the conclusion that it is safer and more economical to lock up his factory than to operate it. But in conjunction with this, I equally uphold the principle that if business finds itself making only meager profits on account of bad management, exorbitant salaries to the executives, want of enterprise, or out-of-date methods, these are not just reasons for reducing the workman's wages. The American working man must not be sentenced to live in poverty because of the philosophy that all profits are to be retained by the stockholders. Lastly, I uphold in principle that if both manufacturers and laborers complain that either there is no business or that present business does not provide sufficient profits to enable all of us to live according to the American standard, then those financiers who are responsible for the famine of money are they who are perpetrating a grievous wrong on both industry and labor, and, consequently, are responsible for an unjust wage. If, therefore, both industry and labor recognize the finance, or rather the lack of finance, is the impediment to progress, they are justified in demanding the removal of that obstacle. For why should the vast masses of labor and of industry be forced to suffer and to live in want and indigence because of the mismanagement of financial affairs, or because the financial system itself is so obsolete that no valid hope is represented for a restoration of prosperity? The sooner we damn and destroy a bad financial philosophy, the happier this nation will be. In the litany of my beliefs relative to a just and living wage, I shall not fail to mention that it is the business of the government, which has been elected by the people, to so regulate industry that work will be provided for all those who are willing to work, and so to regulate the wage scale that, independent of the hours spent by the laborer at his employment, it is commensurate with those annual expenses necessitated for a decent American standard of living. These are the 9 principles related to the second point in my program for a just and living annual wage for all American citizens who are willing and able to work. My friends, man is a social creature. Everywhere about us this fact is self-evident. There are tailors and butchers, shoemakers and toolmakers, shipwrights and physicians, bakers and attorneys, 10,000 different vocations necessary for the sustenance of the life of this nation or of any other nation. No man is sufficient unto himself. Every human activity is dependent upon our common labors. They who are working in the bowels of the earth, fetching out coals to warm our homes, or plowing in distant fields the furrows which will cradle the wheat to bring us nourishment, they are all bound together. Who denies that man is a social creature? Who dares uphold the theory that he who controls one industry or one form of agriculture or one factory is so independent of his fellow citizens that he dares use his produce, though he owns it, to suit his own caprices, careless of the needs and of the rights to life and happiness of his fellow citizens? Laissez-faire may have been the motto of a Robinson Crusoe as, with his man Friday and his unintelligent parrot, he lived a hermit's life far from the paths of trade and commerce and distant from his fellow human beings. But in America, with its dense population, its manifold complexities of life, its necessary dependencies of one citizen upon the other, its intense specializations of activity, only one blinded by greed and stimulated by avarice dares to profess the doctrine that ownership and use are identical things, the same doctrine which proclaims that I may do as I please with my own property and to the devil with the rest of my fellow citizens. I may not do as I please with my own property. Because I am a social creature, I may use my property only in so far as it will be of positive use and of no detriment to my fellow creatures. I may not lock up my property against human needs. I may not lock my factory and prevent people from working when people need to work and while there is purchasing power to consume the product. I may not be unsocial. I may not be a Dillinger either by taking a life by means of a gun or by the slow process of starvation. One is as bad as the other. Man is a social creature. This is the way that God has created us. We will suffer no philosophy emanating from the brain of a creature to overturn the Creator's plans. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to choose between the statement issued by the Prince of Industry, Mr. DuPont, and the one spoken by Donald Reichberg, the Executive Director of the National Emergency Council. Are you for the old deal with its industrial dictatorship and its doctrine of laissez-faireism, or are you for a new deal whereby the government shall legislate against unjust competition, against concentration of the profits in the hands of the stockholders? Are you for the unlimited and unqualified protection of property rights plus use rights, or do you believe in the doctrine of private property, but in the equally important doctrine of governmental limitation of its use and of its profits? As long as the heresy upheld by the modern industrialist is adhered to, namely that use and ownership are identical, there shall follow in its wake indigence and poverty, loss of homes and of farms, and, eventually, strife and bloodshed. Today, perhaps, the industrialist is empowered to call upon the local and the state police forces to protect his factories and his privately owned industries. But unless the doctrine of laissez-faireism or do-as-you-pleaseism takes its place with the theories of slavery, the day will come when neither state nor local police will be able to protect the right to property, let alone the use of it as one pleases. It is the primary duty of the government and of all good citizens to abolish conflict between classes and divergent interests. It is our duty to foster and promote harmony among the various ranks of society. No sane man believes in the possibility of creating harmony by bandaging the festered sores of modern industry. No intelligent person preaches effectively against radicalism if he does not first destroy the causes which create it. Social justice cries aloud to heaven for the working men to unite together with the industrialist, not against him. Social justice cries just as loudly to heaven for the industrialist to unite with the working men, not against them. The industrialist must recognize that the laborers in his factory are not mere chattels, nor are they to be treated less and insured less against the destructive forces of poverty than are his machines, his lathes, and his furnaces, which are housed against the inclemencies of all weather and are insured, in season and out of season, against fire and destruction. Labor is not something that can be bought and sold like any other piece of merchandise. Labor is something human, something sacred. When you employ a man, you are not hiring his muscles or his skill. You are engaging the services of his very soul, which gives life and activity to his skill, of a soul that was inspired by Almighty God to love and to bring little babies into the world, of a soul made to the image and likeness of God, before whose common court you will commonly stand. You are employing the soul of one who is little less than an angel. In one sense, you are attempting to purchase the services of something that is unpurchasable, of something that is immortal. The protection of that human life which, leaving all things else, surrenders itself to your just commands, imposes a duty upon you to care for its just rights, even more sacredly than you care for your property rights. By all the precepts of social justice, you are forbidden to exclude the laborer from a share in the profits just as much as is the same social justice violated by a propertyless earning class who, in the excesses of communism, perhaps would demand for themselves not only a share in the use of your produce, but the total ownership of your private property. While we uphold the doctrine of private ownership, we will not permit you industrialists to forget the equally sacred doctrine of stewardship. One cannot exist without the other. Destroy the stewardship doctrine, and your doctrine of private property is as empty as a sucked eggshell. The doctrine of stewardship means this, that the earth and the fullness thereof belongs to God, that you who acquire private property have done so only under God, that you who cannot exclude from its usage your fellowmen. Never forget that from the natural resources about us and from the unremitting toil of our citizens springs all wealth. It is a toil that is expended upon either one's own private property or the private property belonging to some other person, where capital and labor unite. When labor is willing to supply its brawn and its brain to work at your property, Mr. Industrialist, that same labor cannot be denied a just and living wage which enables it to share reasonably in the produce of American inventions, of American conveniences, as well as in decent necessities of life. That is God's doctrine, not mine. You who fight against it are fighting against the omnipotence of the hand who created you. I ask you, industrialists, if and when you arrive at the point in production where it is necessary to shut down your factories, do you cancel the insurance on your machinery? Do you let it become a prey to rust and destruction? Foolish question for anyone to entertain when, at this very moment, when tomorrow morning, because of these words which I have spoken, you will go running to insurance agencies to purchase riot insurance. Your United States Chamber of Commerce and your other organizations, which you have so ably built up for yourselves, never had the sagacity and the intelligence to estimate the superior value of the hands, the horned hands that worked your machines in your factory, without which your private property would be worth no more than a scrap heap. You can get along without machinery, but you cannot get along without men. More than that, you can get along without advice from your bankers and their outworn philosophy, but you dare not attempt to get along without advice of your laborers, upon whose purchasing power and goodwill you depend. I am not excoriating you industrialists, nor casting upon you the burden of blame altogether for this condition in which we find ourselves. You too have been victimized. But I do castigate you because, like parrots, you have repeated the sophistry of your bankers, your competing manufacturers, if you will, because they manufacture money. You have been foolish enough to let them get away with it. I do blame you for refusing to face facts and for attempting to dwell in the realms of fancy. Today, your only salvation is identified with the establishment of social justice. Today, your redemption is for capital to join labor instead of perpetuating its harlotry with finance. See what this union with finance has accomplished. The J.P. Morgan and Company and Drexel and Company of Philadelphia, who are really no more distinct than a double-yolked egg, have 20 partners as members of the board of directors of trustees of 15 great banks in this nation, having assets total of $3,811,400,000. On 7 holding companies, they control 14 directorships. The assets of these companies total $83,786,475.39. This same colossus of Wall Street has 12 dictatorships in 10 railroad companies, which represent assets of $3,436,666,000. 5 public utility companies representing assets of $3,404,555,000 have 9 Morgan partners as directors. 8 operating utility companies with 10 Morgan-controlled directors are valued at $2,818,147,000. 38 of our largest industrial corporations in America have 55 of Morgan's partners acting as directors or trustees. These corporations are valued at $6,037,644,000. 6 partners of the J.P. Morgan Company are directors or trustees of 6 insurance companies whose total assets are listed at $337,187,000. Moreover, there are over 1,000 corporations related to the Morgan Company where the Colossus acts in the capacity of non-partner directors and trustees. Leaving this latter aside and listing only the former corporations in which the partners of Morgan and Company and Drexel and Company, the twin yolk egg, are listed as being members of the board of directors and trustees, we have assets representing approximately $20 billion. Include the others, the 1,000 corporations, and the assets add to a total of approximately $40 billion, 1/6 of the wealth of the nation, controlled by one man who is a banker by his directors, who direct industry for him. The wedding of the industrialist and the financier has been the destruction of American capitalism. These are governmental figures, not my compilation. This is the financial giant, the Cyclops, with its one eye intent upon gazing at profits. This is the monster of money control against whose fantastic powers we are fighting for a nation's financial independence. This is the brains and the brawn of the financial harlotry which controls the industry of the nation, the transportation of the nation, the telephonic and telegraphic communication of the nation, the insurance companies of the nation, while it holds us in the hollow of its hand and, through its puppets, endeavors to hold on to the old financial system which has made slaves out of civilized people. This is only a sample of the concentration of wealth in the hands of the financial element, because capital, intended by nature to remain fruitful to labor, has gone forth to dwell with the prostitute of finance who manufactures money. See what has occurred in our midst when capital and industry permitted the bankers to dictate the policy of labor. 12 million unemployed, 7 million part-time employed, 17 million Americans living on debts multiplying, taxation mounting, all because you industrialists have conspired with the so-called money manufacturers against the farmer and the laborer and against your own best interests. At this moment, these same financiers who wrecked our country are emerging from their hiding places to plead recognition for their plans of restoration. Do we plan to be placid and apathetic and not unite against them? Are the just and living wage of the rights of the laborer subjects only to be discussed and not reduced to practice? If you believe in these principles which I have unfolded, I ask you to join the National Union for Social Justice.